Hi sewing enthusiasts and cosplay buffs. Welcome to my studio. I'm Lady Delatois. This is Building Steam, the channel where we talk about making, sewing, foamsmithing, cosplay, and all the nerdy things. Today I'm going to be talking about common terms you'll find in patterns, what they mean, and what they really mean. Let's get right into it. This video is a continuation of my So Very Scary series, which is aimed at the beginner sewer, offering mentorship, some tips and advice to help guide you in your learning process. In the last video, I was talking about prepping your fabric, prepping your pattern, getting it cut, getting your fabric cut, basically getting ready to move to the sewing machine and start to sew. Today I'm going to be talking about common terms that you'll run across in your patterns, what they mean, and a little bit beyond the simple definition. So if you got your pattern from one of the big manufacturers like McCall or Simplicity, they will usually have at the beginning of the pattern a glossary that defines the terms that are used in that particular pattern. And this is really invaluable for you to go back and look at when you come across those terms in your pattern. However, a lot of times when I first started sewing, I would go and look at that and have to stare at it a while before it made any sense to me. So it's good to have a little bit of review before you even begin. Probably one of the first terms that you're going to run into, very likely in step 1 or 2, is stay stitching. Now, stay stitching is a line of small stitches that is sewn just to the inside of the seam line, which is usually 5/8 of an inch in the commercial pattern. So you would be sewing it at about 4/8 of an inch. This line of stitching helps prevent things like necklines and curves from warping under the stress of wearing the garment. Now, since it is a line of stitching that doesn't connect one piece to the other, it can feel a little bit like, do I really have to do this? Yes. Yes, you do have to do it. If you're going to spend all of this time hand constructing a garment, you don't want it to warp out of all recognition the first time that you wear it, or even while you're in the process of sewing it. It's going to take you like 10 seconds. So sew in that stay stitching and sew it in the direction of the arrows in the illustration on the pattern. So that's a pretty easy definition, but I do have one little bit of advice to give you that I learned the hard way. I was really concerned with the stay stitching being too close to the seam line because I didn't want it to show on the outside of my project. So the first few things that I made, I had a tendency to put the stay stitching more at like 3/8 of an inch, closer to the edge of the fabric. However, a lot of times one of your instructions is going to be trim your seam. So then I would either have the choice of having bulk in my seam or trimming my stay stitching right off, which kind of makes it pointless if you cut it away. It really does need to be close to the seam line. As you get more experienced in your sewing, you will get better at judging those little distances, that 4/8 of an inch or the 5/8 of an inch. You really begin to be able to eyeball it. So the second phrase you're going to run into an awful lot in patterns is baste. So what is baste or basting? No, it doesn't have anything to do with turkeys. Basting in sewing is using a long machine stitch or hand sewing a long running stitch to temporarily hold fabric in place. So patterns are going to tell you to use basting in a whole bunch of different circumstances. And I'm not going to lie, sometimes it's super important to baste, and sometimes you don't need to do it at all. And the trick is figuring out which time is which. Sometimes the pattern instructions will tell you to place 2 pieces together, baste along the seam line, and then sew. And I think to myself, if I'm just going to be sewing this together in 10 seconds anyway, why am I going to waste the time to baste them together? So I don't. And it's usually okay. But if you're doing something more complex, like setting a sleeve or sewing together two curved pieces, you might want to go ahead and baste them just to make sure that you don't end up with a final product that's more uneven than DC's track record making superhero films. So what I'm saying is, patterns are going to tell you to baste in a whole lot of situations and a whole lot of the time, and you don't always need to do it. It's kind of a cover your ass situation for them. They don't want you to mess up something just from your fabric pieces sliding apart. As you become more experienced, you're going to know when it's really necessary to do it and when it's not. When you start out, baste everything, and then you won't have to worry. Next up, edge stitching. So that's just what it sounds like. You add a second row of stitching right next to the seam line on the front of the fabric after you've sewn two pieces together. Edge stitching is done as a reinforcing stitch or a decorative stitch. It is similar to top stitching, but is done closer to the seam line than top stitching is done, and it is usually done in the same thread and in the same color. So that's a pretty simple and easy explanation, but is so often the case with sewing. What is simple and easy on paper is a little more difficult in practice. Since edge stitching is going to be on the front of your project, it's going to be visible for the world to see, which means that this is your opportunity to really screw things up. If you don't work slowly and carefully, your edge stitching line is going to be as drunk and erratic as you at your last con, as a toddler on meth. If you don't take your time, work slowly and carefully, and really pay attention to the measurement lines on your sewing machine as you are sewing, your edge stitching line is going to be as drunk and erratic as a toddler on 3 candy bars and no nap. But no worries, with enough practice, your edge stitching will be tidy, neat, and straight. Magic, the gathering. Gathering is great and kind of magical. It allows you to pull in a whole bunch of fabric and get it to fit to another piece of fabric, creating drape and flow and sleeves and pants fitting into their waistlines. So we really do use it a whole lot. A lot of times the pattern directions will actually describe to you exactly how they want you to gather up the fabric. It will tell you to use Why? It will tell you to use long machine stitches to sew a line along the seam line, and then to do a second row of stitches parallel to the first, about 1/4 of an inch away in the seam allowance, leaving long tails on both ends that allow you to pull in on the bobbin thread and gather the fabric together. For a long time, as a beginner sewer, I just thought this was how it was done. I didn't know there was any other method to doing it, and I kind of dreaded it every time that I would see the word gathering, because I would follow the instructions, and especially on projects with a really, really long ruffle or a really tight gather, you get partway through it and then your bobbin thread snaps. And you think, well, that's okay. That's what the second line is for. And you start pulling on that one, and then that one breaks too. And then you're homicidal and probably armed with some very sharp scissors. So it's not a good scenario. I did eventually find different methods of gathering for different situations. Patterns will almost always tell you to gather in exactly the same way, and it just doesn't always apply. If I'm setting a sleeve, I definitely still use those 2 rows of gathering stitches because it is usually a fairly small gather. It's just as easy to do it that way. But if I'm doing something like a ruffled skirt, in which I have yards and yards and yards of fabric that I have to ruffle up, and it tells me to do a gather along the entire circumference of that loop, I'm not going to do that because that's stupid. If you're doing a really long gather, I would suggest that you only do the gathering stitches from one seam to another, and then you break off and you do another set of stitches from one seam to another. That way you have lots of control over how much you are gathering at one time, and you're not pulling such a long section of thread. I would also recommend learning the zigzag method of gathering, which is where you take a nice strong piece of thread like button thread and you zigzag stitch over it so that you are not stitching that thread down. It sits down in between the middle of the zigzags. And then you can have very, very clean, neat, even gathers all the way across your project. This is the way that I usually gather now for anything other than a very short gather. Understitching. Dun dun dun. So we've had stay stitching, we've had edge stitching, and now we've got understitching. You can stitch in all the different directions. It's great. Except understitching is not great. Understitching is terrible, and I hates it, but it's also really necessary. What is it? What it is an opportunity for everything that was been going swimmingly to go terribly, terribly, terribly wrong. Okay, so that's not super helpful. What would be helpful? Telling you what understitching is. When you are sewing, say, a piece of facing to your the front of your project, or say a lining, which is kind of the same thing as the facing, we use understitching to keep that facing or lining from rolling towards the front. Keeps it nice and flat, clean, and professional looking. After you've sewn your lining or your facing to the fabric piece, you take the seam and you press it towards the lining side. Then you sew in the seam allowance as close as you can to the seam line, a nice line all the way down on that lining or facing side of the project. So why do I hate it? What? Doesn't sound so hard. It never sounds hard. A lot of times it'll say understitch as far as you can. This is code for you're gonna reach a point where it f***s up. Because you're going to be trying to go around a curve or a corner or where it meets a seam. You just can't work it through your sewing machine. I was very stubborn when I first started doing this, and I was like, well, I gotta do it. It says as far as I can, so I really gotta make it go as far as I can. And then you end up with weird gathers where you've pulled in the front of your fabric into your understitching, or you end up with understitching on the wrong side of the seam line where it can be seen on the front of your project. And then you have to pick it all up. And anything that makes me take out my seam ripper makes me unhappy. Even now, having been sewing for several years, I still get nervous when I see the words understitch as far as you can. It's one of those horrible but necessary things like colonoscopies or mammograms. The final phrase that I want to talk about here today is ease or easing. And patterns use this phrase in a couple of different ways to make sure that you're really frickin' confused. One of the ways that patterns use the term ease is when they talk about the total ease of the finished garment. That means how much bigger the finished garment is going to be than your actual body measurements. So somewhere on the pattern itself, on the tissue paper of the pattern, there's usually a set of measurements that tells you exactly how big the finished garment is going to be, and this allows you to judge how baggy, how much bigger you want it to be, or how close fitting that it's going to be to your body. But that doesn't really have anything to do with the way that they talk about easing in pattern instructions. So when they use the term ease in pattern instructions, they're using a long machine stitch, similar to when you gather, to make one piece that is just slightly bigger than the other one fit into the other piece. And we don't want to have the tucks and ruches that a gather has. You want to simply be able to blend the two pieces together so that you end up with a nice, clean, and neat seam. The other way that they talk about it in the same fashion is they talk about when you do a hem. And say you're making a skirt that has a flared hem. So if my hem goes out this way, and I go to fold it up, the very bottom edge is going to be longer than the top where I am folding it up to, if that makes sense. And so I have to do something with that extra fabric. And a lot of times what patterns will say is, sew in a narrow hem and ease in fullness. And the first time that I read that, I didn't know what that meant. And the second time that I read that, I didn't know what it meant. And the third time I decided that what that actually means is, no matter what you do, this seam is going to be puckered on the inside. I call it the butthole hem. If you use a basting stitch all across the bottom of the hem to carefully tease in some easing as you move along, it takes patience, practice, and godlike powers, I'm fully convinced. It can be difficult to make the fabric behave, especially when you've got just a little bit more of it on one side of the line than the other. But what I want you guys to understand is that you're not alone. All of us struggled through these difficult puckered hems. We suffered through trying to make our gathers sit evenly across the space, and through not understanding what the patterns are saying to us. Sometimes it seems like they're written in some kind of intentional code, and if we don't understand the code, then we can't complete the project correctly. It's like a struggle. So I hope today I helped you decode some of these pattern phrases that seem like plain English, but they're really not. So if you enjoyed this video, I hope that you would give it a thumbs up, a nice like, and hit that subscribe button so you get notified when the next one comes out. Make sure that you also check out the other videos in this So Very Scary series. I did try to make this one a little bit shorter so that it's a little bit less of a time investment. Next time, I will talk about using your sewing machine and putting together a basic pattern. So if you're super into cosplay beyond sewing and you're interested in foam smithing, you should definitely check out my husband's last video that he posted on this channel. He posted his work in progress Lord of Blades, and it is sick, man. You gotta check that out. It's crazy. He's a wizard. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Happy making.